This episode is brought to you by Portland Distro. If you like underground music, movies, and more, go to portlanddistro.com for licensed merch, vinyl, CDs, and more. Plug in the discount code 10OFF, TENOFF, for a 10% discount at portlanddistro.com. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Darkness Weaves, a collaboration between Everything Went Black and Sol Nox, Karl Edward's podcast. Anyone who's been following this sub-series understands that it is our attempt at covering the work of Karl Edward Wagner, a conspicuously obscure author of fantasy, horror, and weird fiction. And we just think everyone should know about him. He's an incredible writer. And most of his work is actually out of print, with the exception of In a Lonely Place, which the wonderful Valancourt Books have put back in print. And phase one of this project was our coverage of that volume of incredible weird fiction and horror stories. Our next mission is to cover the stories of his character Kane, a sword and sorcery character who is more of a villain / anti-hero and is not very heroic, very self-serving in a lot of ways. And Karl and I are going to be delving into the numerous short stories and novels that Wagner wrote about this fascinating character. So today's episode, this week's episode, is the short story Two Suns Setting. And we're going to read an excerpt from the story which really sets the tone for this tale. But before we do that, I want to shout out the other members of the Horsemen of the Podcasting Apocalypse, kicking the week off on Mondays, every other Monday. We have Brandon Legion bringing us Horror Wolf 666. Next up, Jackie Smith's Into the Necrosphere, the premier metal podcast on the internet. Wednesday, of course, is Everything Went Black. Thursday is Necro Thursday. I return with Mike Scandato and Jeff Kashid to bring you our analysis of new and old horror films. Friday, Mike's brother, John Draper, deploys Spitball Media, which has actually been doing a lot of discussion of horror films as well, but sort of a general cultural commentary podcast, and highly recommended by all of us. Saturday's day off. Sunday, Karl brings us Sol Nox for all things dark, esoteric, and macabre. And our newest member of the Horsemen, Cheyenne of the great band Trivax, brings us Iblis Manifestations. Those are deployed as needed, so they kind of drop in at just the right time. If you like the show, I urge all of you to follow us on social media. Instagram, if you want to get at me, the best bet is to hit me on Instagram. I don't really delve too much into social media these days. It's been a deliberate attempt of mine to live in the real world. But if you want to contact me, hit me up through Instagram, mostly on my personal one, the Michael D.C. Hill Instagram, or on Everything Went Black. That's probably the best ways to get in touch with me. If you want to support the show further, you can join the Patreon. And that has several tiers, a $1 tier, a $5 tier, and a sponsor $25 tier. And you can join for as long as you want, 1 month, or for all eternity. But you get bonus material, early access to episodes, and that sort of thing. Sullen red disk. The sun was burying itself beneath a monotonous horizon of rolling gravel waste that stretched behind him, miles uncounted, and possibly untrod save for his horse's hooves. Long before the sunlight failed, its warmth was snuffed out in the empty lifelessness of the desert, so that in its last hour the sun shone cheerless as the rising moon. Crimson as it climbed, the full moon seemed a false dawn to mock the dying sun, arriving prematurely, disrespectful as a greedy heir pacing in eager impatience before the master's deathbed. For a space, the limitless skies of the twilight displayed two rubrous globes low on either horizon, so that Kane mused as to whether his long journey across the desert might not have led him to some strange dusk world where two ancient suns smoldered in the heavens. The region seemed unearthly in its chill desolation, and certainly an aura of unguessable antiquity hung as a gray shadow over each tumbled bit of stone. So we're deep into the work of Karl Edward Wagner's heroic fantasy character, Kane. This is our second story in this phase of Darkness Weaves. And as I mentioned in the intro, the story that we're going to be covering is Two Suns Setting. And it's in that volume that's out there on Kindle with the awful covers. But Carl and I are working through this thing, and hopefully somebody makes a proper republishing of the Night Winds collection, and we get like a nice hard volume, like hard copy of this stuff to enjoy someday soon.
Yeah, it would be cool if Valancourt did a version of Night Winds or something. That'd be pretty cool. But somebody, yeah,
Yeah.
like anybody, it's like anybody put out a new edition.
Yeah, the more I I've read these short stories a few times. First
Yeah,
I got into the character when I was in high school, and I just read it at face value. At that time, I hadn't really been exposed to like a lot of other literature, and I just read it as like awesome adventure stories, with sorcery and sword fights and all that sort of stuff. And but later on in life, as you get more experience with other types of literature and you have a life experience and things like that, you start to really appreciate the layers to the character of Kane, and what a complex sort of character he is, and I remember, in various readings, different blogs and whatever, they refer, and probably like annoyingly so, they refer to the Kane stories as thinking man's sword and sorcery.
right. But I think that they kind of are in a way. But that's kind of a little bit though. Um, I don't. I think that Robert E. Howard stuff was thinking man's sword and sorcery. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that's kind of downplaying that the genre itself. Obviously you got like kind of like stuff that's just you know, whatever, not very, just standard sword and sorcery. But if you go back to the roots of the genre of like Robert E. Howard stuff, I mean, it's already thinking man's stuff. There's a lot of, you know, meditations on philosophy and like the nature of humanity and stuff that we see in Kane as well, which we'll get into if this story really gets into a lot of that same type of like kind of in a way pessimistic philosophies that you'd see even on like Howard stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was responding to that in the same way that people refer to like elevated horror. It's like annoying when people refer to horror films as elevated horror, meaning that there's like more to it, than just like slashers and whatnot. But if you're going to say Thinking Man, Sword and Sorcery, I would definitely include Robert E. Howard. I would include Michael Moorcock's work, Elric and Corum and like all that sort of stuff. I would throw in Fritz
Yeah,
Leiber, Fritz Leiber's stories, like all that sort of stuff. All of it is like thinking man, sword and sorcery. And there's a lot of heavy like topics and philosophies being described in all that work.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that that's one of those things of kind of it's like that kind of like dance where you're kind of like trying to like make something like better than other things when it's like kind of ignoring the fact that the things you're trying to like kind of, I don't know, elevate it from are already that way, you know? So it's
Right.
like this whole like elevated horror thing is stupid because it's like kind of saying that horror is like just trash and this is like real art or something when you already have plenty of horror movies and since the 30s that since the beginning of horror that all quote unquote elevated, you know what I mean? So
Yeah. Yeah. So
I feel like the same way with this.
at the beginning of Two Suns Setting, we find Kane. He had just fled Carsyltyal, the city that he was living in last episode that we covered in Undertow. So
Yeah.
he's quit that city. You got the sense that he just kind of grabbed all of his gear, jumped on a horse, and lit out of town, most likely in the middle of the night under the cover of darkness.
Yeah,
Across
and it's funny. Well, it's funny too because it says like you could have taken on the sorcerers who kind of like united against him, but he's like, nah, I'm tired of this place anyway, so why fight? You know?
and he lost his his love, and all he wanted was like a girlfriend forever. So now he's like, the hell with it, I'm just gonna have adventures. I'm gonna go into the desert and just find out what's going on in the rest of the, gonna quit this city. And it kind of starts out like, it almost reminds me of like a Sergio Leone sort of high plains drifter western kind of setting, you know what I mean? The way they describe the landscape, and he's on a horse and he's crossing some desolate, desert. And what kind of sets the
Yeah,
tone is the rising of the moon and the setting of the sun. And in that intro that I read, which I thought was a very powerful way to start the story, and it kind of gives you a little foreshadowing to what's actually going on, is that it's almost like he views it as almost like there's two suns in the sky. One is exiting the world and one is entering the world. And it
yeah,
just sets up
which
this
is
like
kind of
really, really nice brooding like atmosphere.
yeah, because that's kind of central to the themes of the story is that kind of idea of time and one thing dying, another thing rising, and I do agree with you. It definitely has like a spaghetti western or a western type of feeling of like the setting and him riding across this desert and the kind of lone rider. Like it definitely ties into those types of images, which probably is purposeful, I would imagine.
So one of the things that's interesting is he's running out of food and water. Okay. So question I have, Kane's immortal and he can't be killed. So what would happen if he actually starved? What do you think?
I think you just keep going, but I think wouldn't be very pleasant for him.
Yeah, just
Seems
think
like.
it would be like a diminished version of himself, like, like this kind of emaciated body, like pulling itself across the terrain. Do you think that would be his fate? Like he wouldn't actually die?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because it's kind of put that he needs food or he's hungry for food and want and stuff. So I would assume that if he couldn't eat or whatever, he would just like live on as like become some type of desiccated wraith or something. You know what I mean?
Interesting. Yeah.
I
I
don't
was
know.
thinking, I
That's
was
just
thinking the
my
same
my
thing.
idea of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So as he's traveling, he starts smelling cooking meat. And of course, you're a starving man and you want to investigate what the source of this smell is, because you're hopeful that the person cooking this food might share this with you. You know what I mean? So this is where we find Dwasslir, the giant. And
Yeah.
he's camped out, he's got an encampment, and he's got this beast that he felled and he's cooking it up. And Kane rolls up on his horse and he's like, hey, how's it going? You mind sharing some of that meat you're cooking with me?
Yeah. And he finds out Kane like Dwasslir like knows who he is, He knows the mark of Cain, which I kind of think is his eyes. I think that the mark of Cain in the story is his eyes. Like because he references that in the first story as well.
Yeah,
But I don't know. But it might be on his forehead. But he always wears the thing over his head. But you know what I mean. I
I
get a
agree.
feeling that sometimes it's like something about his eyes seems to be important. But so Dwasslir knows who he is, and Kane, and yeah, and they get down to like eating basically, and then after they eat, they have like a long philosophical conversation, which is exactly what I was talking about. You know what I mean? Was it being very philosophical story?
Well, one of the things that's really cool about this story too is, in this story, you get the sense of man being a relatively new inhabitant of this world, and that there were other races and kingdoms that existed way before the arrival of man on this planet, and they also make reference to Cain being like of the original men, like the first men.
Yeah, which I even like make a um, what was the where he talks about trying to find the mark, but there's part where he's talking about that man. Oh yeah, my race is older than yours. We had grown to maturity while a mad god was playing his idiot game of shaping mankind from the bestial filth that sculpt where shadow lay deepest.
It's a good one, yeah. And there's
Yeah,
also like this very interesting sort of dichotomy about what entails a successful race, a successful race of people. Like Kane is very much of that human expansionist sort of point of view, where he talks
yeah,
about, shaping the world in the image of man, and Dwasslir talks about living in harmony with the world and nature, and he looks at that as more of like having less impact on the world. And Kane is like, I'm gonna, create empires and kingdoms and, mold the world in my image. So there's two very different thought processes about their, their different races and like what's successful and what's not.
yeah. Like it strikes me that with Dwasslir and the Giants, like they lived in this kind of state of like primordial struggle. You know what I mean? Which became like elevated to that's their civilization. Like it's not necessarily like they don't believe in like building monuments and doing all this stuff, but they like basically their civilization is based around the idea of overcoming adversity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And and they kind of see mankind as being kind of like this pitiful like creature that came and is basically like usurping nature and usurping their place, and even says like man has stolen his civilization from the ruins of better races preceded him. Human civilization is a parasitic, a gaudy fungus that owes its vitality to the dead genius upon whose corpse it flourishes.
Yeah, that's pretty heavy, man. That's a great
Yeah,
quote. Yeah, and
yeah,
I think this story really, I mean, even if you tie the title of the story, that opening paragraph, and this discussion between Dwasslir and Kane, this is like really the meat of the story. I mean, there's like adventure and stuff like that, but the takeaway for me is just that conversation that they're having over the campfire about like the two different approaches to living. And and Kane brings up the point that the Giants are on their way out, like, okay, so much for your idea of primordial struggle and living in harmony with the rest of the world. Like, you're one of the last of your people, and here I am, mankind is like overrun the entire face of the planet, and we have these monuments and empires, and even though Kane has seen all these empires rise and fall too because he's immortal, but he still sees man as like this, it's here to stay basically.
yeah. And like you get some other information where it seems like you start to get a kind of view into Kane as well, that in the world that this is like maybe Earth, very early. There's you get the sense that it's the rise of man, but then there's all these things before mankind, like you said, not just giants, but elder races, which I'm assuming is tying Kane into the Lovecraft mythos. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, definitely.
So, so he's talking about, I talk about these things, and when Kane brings up these ideas, this the fact that, hey, I mean, like man's on the ascendant, your race is kind of going down. Dwasslir says, like, I think our race has grown old and tired. Maybe we should have followed the giant beasts of the savage past into the realm of shadow. At least our old enemies gave life adventure. It's as if my race has lived beyond its era, and now we perish from boredom. Or like one of your kings has conquered all his enemies, and now only has a dull old age to endure. My race rose in a heroic age, Kane. It was truly a day of giants in that era. That age is dead. Gone are the great beasts. Vanished the elder races whose wars rocked the roots of mountains. Earth has been inherited by the insignificant scavenger. Man crawls around the ruins of the great age and proclaims himself to be Earth's new master. Perhaps man will survive to accomplish his insolent usurpation. More likely, he will destroy himself in seeking to command the mysteries the elder races found too awesome for even their powers to control. You know?
Yeah, that's one of the things that these stories really, really capture is like the idea of deep time, and even today, like even in our society, we think of mankind as like, the history of our planet beginning with the history of mankind, but there's been thousands, millennia prior to man's inhabitation of the planet that have existed, and the Kane stories really speak to that because of his immortality, and then conversations with a past race of giants who talk about how man is just like these upstarts, and there's these elder races that once were mighty and ruled the planet. And that's one of the coolest things about these stories, really, is that idea of deep time and infinity and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's something you get in Howard as well at times, and it's
Yeah.
also part of what was great about Tolkien as well. Like is when you read the Lord of the Rings and you have these type of moments where you kind of peek behind a veil at the immeasurable time that has passed. Like the age of epic heroes and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like it gives you that little bit of taste of that, how deep time of a time that's kind of beyond what mankind can even comprehend.
So this is when Dwasslir talks about an ancient king and a tomb and a crown, that he is inspired to find this crown so that he could bring it back to his people and once again restore them to a place of glory in the world. So it's like this kind of romantic, fanciful idea of a quest to elevate the giants back into what he believes to be their place of significance in the world instead of falling into obscurity.
Yeah, apparently the crown is somewhere in the mountain ranges nearby. And he also talks about how the land used to be like green and verdant until like something happened where it became like this desert. Maybe because of the elder races doing their stuff. I don't remember if it says exactly why it became like a desert, but back when the giants lived in this area, it was like a verdant land. And I think isn't there a part where Kane says something about how he doesn't recognize the land, but he had visited here when at some point in time, right? So
Yes, yeah, that's a recurring thing in a lot of the stories of Kane, where he's been around for he's an immortal, so he's been around since millennia basically, and that's one of the things where that's a returning thing in this thing, where he'll be in a city and he'll, like, once again, like Carsyltyal, he remembers that being just like a fishing village at some point, and now it's like this mighty city, this like place of seat of power, but he remembers it being nothing much than just a collection of huts and fishermen.
Yeah. And I mean, you could imagine that, let's say if he's been in, he knows how to speak giant. He's been speaking the giant language to Dwasslir and everything. You get the sensation that, yeah, he probably spent time with them at some point, but now the landscape is so completely different than it was when he was there. They probably didn't recognize it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and also you get this sense. I mean, even in like our short lifespans, if you think back like 20 years ago or something, like you could barely remember shit. It's like I try
Well,
to
yeah.
think back to like high school or whatever, and it's like, did that actually happen? Were these real people? Like this, are these situations something that I imagined, or they really happened? So imagine Kane with his memory going back thousands of years, and how some of these thoughts that he has when he goes to these places, he probably is like, did I even do this? Is this even like real? Is it, or just an imagination that I have?
Yeah. Well, then also like, I think of, uh, if you think about like, I don't know how it is there, but here in Denver, like there's places that I grew up with that I go to now that I don't even recognize. Like if you don't go there for, like I went to go like this one area for like, a few years. And I went there and they had developed it so much to the point that I didn't know where I was. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely.
So so even in the space of a human life, things can change so drastically that you can't even recognize it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So imagine what Kane has to deal with his, thousands of years of life that he's lived.
Yeah, it's like how long has he spent in Carsyltyal? Like excited about the growing civilization and uncovering all these secrets of the elder races. So he's probably been there for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, something like that. You know what I mean? Who knows how long he spent there?
Well, even it's never really determined, like even between Undertow and Two Suns Setting, like how much time has passed. They just talk about how he left the city. Like for all we know, there could have been a couple of 100 years have passed since that whole drama that what happened with in Undertow. He could have just stayed there for like another 100 years and decided to leave.
Yeah, exactly. We don't really know these types of things. Like much like with the Conan stuff, it's a little bit vague. You know what I mean? You kind of just have to you know make your own assumptions about it. But I get a sensation he's been there for a long time. But I feel like the curse of Cain, which goes in the beginning, is that he gets boredom. Boredom is the curse of Cain in a lot of ways. I feel like that's the curse that he's been given.
Exactly. And loneliness, and just, yeah, that actually, what do you make of people's conjecture that Cain is the biblical Cain? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that you can kind of get that from that quote where he's like this mad God who created mankind. Like I definitely think that Cain is technically is supposed to be kind of the biblical Cain, because also when he's talking about kind of he's about
And also Cain, the biblical Cain who slew his brother Abel, if you want to follow that mythology, that Cain also starts out sort of morally ambiguous. And as we in all of these Cain stories, we see that that is very much a defining characteristic of Cain's personality is his moral ambiguity.
yeah, and also Cain in legend became, when he went east of Eden, he was actually a creator of civilization in a lot of the legends, like, which is part of why there was like, he was the people, the in a lot of Judaic myth, what was like seen as Cain was the one who went and created like Samaria and like, like the civilizations that rose up in Canaan and stuff like that. So him being kind of like a figure of civilization and everything would be actually pretty appropriate for him for his myth. You know what I mean?
So Dwasslir and Kane decide to go embark on this journey to find this crown. And so they set out on the desert. And this is also another sort of moment where we get to understand how the passage of time, there's this rock formation that Kane observes, and he's like, not sure if it's a rock formation or some incredibly old structure that's been eroded by the wind and sand. And I thought that was like a
Yeah.
really, really cool point in the story.
Yeah. I mean, 'cause that can be the case. Like, there's places that used to be, fortifications or cities that people later on took to be just like a formation, and then later on they found out that no, this is like a city. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's very appropriate.
So they find the opening to a cave where they've figured out that this is where the tomb of the king is, and of course Dwasslir, being a giant, he can't fit in there, so he convinces Kane to go in there and check it out and do some recon.
Yeah, because there was like a rock fall or something, so the cave's like kind of potentially coming down. You know what I mean? Like the rocks are coming down, so there's just like a gap just big enough for Kane to go through, maybe.
Yeah, and this is actually, in this story, we kind of determine how big Kane is. He's over 6 feet tall and just over 300 pounds.
Yeah,
They talk about
300 pounds of bone, sinew, and muscle.
yeah, just like some jacked like guy that's 300 pounds of muscle.
Yeah.
Funny.
So, I mean, he's 6 feet tall. He's going to be almost look like a wrestler, probably, right? To be 300 pounds and all muscle.
Yeah. I wonder if they had steroids back then,
He'd definitely actually, Arnold would be if Arnold would have had like red hair, he'd be that kind of Kane body type, I guess.
I know that it's like definitely wishing beyond any kind of like rationality, but I so would love to see like a really well done like series, especially these days, chronicling all these stories.
Oh yeah, it would be really cool, but I just worry that they like ruin it.
Yeah, that's always like the risk these days of making not catching all the subtleties and all the the kind of like really cool literary parts of this.
Yeah, exactly. Like either just making it like claptrap or like watering it down. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because as later is illustrated in this, Kane's not a good guy at all. Actually, he's
No, he's not.
definitely in like Dungeons and Dragons, I would say that he's chaotic. I would say at the very best, chaotic neutral.
Yeah, yeah. I'd say he's probably chaotic neutral, if not evil. 'Cause I feel like he's neutral in the sense that I don't think he's like doing things to be evil necessarily, but he's just like, yeah, in D&D it would be neutral where he can go either way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. He is like 50-50, like in all these stories. And it's like, yeah, like for example, in Undertow, he's the bad guy. Like if you were to make like a horror story based on that, he would be the villain in that story, definitely.
Oh yeah, he's like the Dracula kind of in that story, but then in this he's a little bit more of the hero in a lot of ways, or the adventurer. You know what I mean? So it kind of gives you a different viewpoint on him, and it's one story where he's actually like the main character.
Yeah. So he's deep in this cave, and this is where he does actually find. They're right that this is where the king, his tomb is, and he observes this like crown and this king, and this is where we really get to see the true peril of being involved with Kane, because he considers at one point either murdering Dwasslir and taking the crown for himself, or exiting the cave and be like, oh yeah, there was nothing in there, and then just come back on his own to steal it.
Yeah, but he kind of forgoed that in his excitement, where his first thing was to tell Dwasslir, oh yeah, it's here, and then he's like, damn it, I shouldn't have done
Yeah,
that.
yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah. So it's like,
Yeah,
and once again, it's I'm really fascinated by just like his amorality, and how that connects, number one, with like, if he is the original Kane from the biblical legends, how that Kane, was sort of a bad guy. And and also just over the eons of being alive, how your point of view on morality probably gets eroded, as time goes on and you develop this like deep cynicism and self-centeredness because that's all you have is yourself. Like everyone's growing old and dying and all these kingdoms are crumbling and you really get a sense that nothing is permanent except for you. So why follow any of these rules? And it's almost like this kind of like, almost like a satanic sort of Luciferian, philosophy, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's kind of a lawless, he's trying to follow his own law in a lot of ways, and I get that with Undertow that he's putting his own will he's trying to impinge his own will onto everybody and everything around him in a lot of ways, you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so I mean that's like definitely like a big factor in all these stories too, is just like, his own will and lawlessness and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And from this story, even though he thinks these things, he ends up doing basically kind of doing the right thing in a lot of ways, and he tells Dwasslir, but Dwassler's so excited. It's like you know, his lifelong dream. Like, and Dwasslir is pretty old himself, like he can still remember back in the old days of the Giants and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like he's been maybe not as old as Kane, but he's pretty old. And it's been his dream since he was, his whole life. So he's like super excited and he starts trying to like, pull out all the bricks, the boulders, and get everything out of his way to get so he can get into the cave and see Dwasslir's body. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and as part of that, all of a sudden the cave itself collapses. Kane gets away from it, but there's there was like a fissure like in the mountain, and when that shifted, the fissure opened up even more. And that's
Yeah.
when we get to see some of the denizens of the underworld that emerge.
Yeah, that's when things get interesting, where there's this this creatures that have been like locked away and have evolved to live in the darkness, of course, whenever a creature evolves in darkness, they always seem to be larger than they would be, like whenever you hear read these stories, like so like a rat is like gigantic and cockroaches are huge, and
Yeah, like in this story, the rats are like cat size.
yeah, exactly, and this is also one of my favorite tropes in these stories is the underground creatures. These that's a big trope, and a lot of different, like Arthur Machen has a lot of things that come from the underworld, and of course these Edgar Rice Burroughs and some of his famous stories have creatures that come from deep within the earth, and that's like a trope for a lot of this kind of fantasy.
Yeah, and Wagner, I think, really likes that. I mean, it's in his Bran Mac Morn novel. It's in a few of the stories that we read.
Yep.
Like so. I think it seems to be something that he's really fascinated with.
Well, there's the Howard Brand McMorran story, Worms of the Earth, which is like another
Yeah,
deep in the earth sort of story, which is a classic in my opinion.
yeah, yeah. And there's a few of Howard's horror stories also have some similar stuff with like the going into the earth and encountering the serpent people and all that stuff like that. This story, I think, in a way, owes more to maybe Edgar Rice Burroughs or something like that than that. 'Cause the things that we see are prehistoric, basically creatures that from the age of heroes, essentially.
Exactly.
Like they try to like open up the like Kane decides not to go down into the road to hell, as he says, and he says tries to maybe start working on getting himself out of the where the rock slide was, and then he finds out that Dwasslir is okay. So Dwassler's trying to like open things up for him so he can get in. and then Dwasslir wants to get in, and Kane wants to get out. So he's trying to get everything away from the rock. But that's when another denizen of the deep comes out, which is a gigantic albino saber-toothed tiger, like that's even bigger than the ancient saber-toothed tigers.
Of course, of course, of course. There's a giant saber-toothed tiger waiting for them in the caves. And it attacks Kane,
Yeah,
and but
yeah,
Dwasslir does battle with it, and they have this epic fight between the saber-tooth and Dwasslir, and he dispatches the saber-tooth, but he is in turn mortally wounded, though. And
yeah.
yeah,
And
so
this is after he managed to get in with like the. I think didn't he get in with like putting the his axe like to hold up the stuff, and then he got in so he could see the
the crown.
the saber-tooth tiger, yeah, the crown. I mean, and the tiger attacks, and also like so part of the rock falls down and pins Kane to the wall as well. So he's trying to hold off.
I think I lost you, Carl. Yep, you're back.
Oh, are you there?
Yep, I'm still here.
I don't know what happened.
No, I just one of
Cut
those.
off.
Yeah,
But yeah. So then you get this epic battle between Dwasslir and the tiger, where he kills it with his bare hands. Yeah, but he's mortally wounded. But luckily, he did get to look on the crown of his king,
yeah,
and I think Kane brings it to him, puts it on him and stuff as well.
yeah. And this is like a rare moment of Kane being kind of sentimental about this whole thing too. Because he could have just like left with the crown and the riches associated with it, but out of like I guess respect for Dwasslir, and his romantic quest for finding this crown, he leaves him with it. And yeah, this story had like this kind of like sad, like brooding quality to it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the ending's very kind of melancholy because you got Dwasslir like he's finally achieved his quest, but he dies in pursuit of it. But then Kane's like, well, you killed the last like probably like this like saber tooth that's even bigger, like trying to kind of like I guess just kind of a sadness about it because it's definitely the setting sun of the giants. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And they're this dying race. The saber tooth itself was from another time, and in Kane, even though he's thousands of years old, in the context of deep time, is a relative upstart in the world. So there we have this metaphor of two suns setting, one sun rising and one sun setting, like that's put out in the beginning opening paragraphs of the story. And it's yeah, it's very poignant and very well done, I thought.
Yeah, I think it's got a very like strong melancholy to it, which I think seems to be a thing with Kane stories. They just have this kind of dark melancholy to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And yeah, it's kind of what sets this character. Like I said, we have the iconic characters of Conan and Elric, and the Tolkien characters, and Kane is just like left out of that conversation, man. And it's a real, I think so many people would appreciate this stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that even though Kane is probably what Wagner's most famous for, it seems like that has kind of waned since this work's been out of print. Maybe like the height of Kane being popular is probably what I would imagine is probably the '80s, right? Maybe the
Yeah.
early '90s, like where like Elric's kind of lived on in a lot of ways, but but Kane, yeah, for whatever reason, Kane's kind of drifted off into obscurity, which I think mostly is because it's been out of print.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
I would blame that for it,
yeah, I mean, there's a new Elric book that came out last year. You know what I mean? So, Moorcock
Yeah,
is still active, and Wagner is deceased at this point. For a couple of decades, and
yeah. I
and
think,
he's out of print.
yeah, I think if Wagner had just still alive, like how Moorcock is, I think that his work would still be in print, and I also think that we probably would have gotten a lot more work from him, over the past he died in the '90s, right? So it's been almost
Yeah.
30 years, right?
Yep.
So it's like I think that I think too, like it seems like Wagner didn't have like somebody like how like when Lovecraft died and you had like Derleth and Wandry and all these people who kind of were like dedicated to keeping his memory alive,
Yeah.
and keeping his stuff in print. I don't think really it's very obvious that Wagner's like estate didn't have that kind of drive to keep his name out there. You know what I mean? Or whoever was in charge of his work after his death.
Yeah, and the real irony of that too is that Wagner was like very much hands-on with keeping Howard's work in print too, with his stuff that he was doing and his pastiche novels that he wrote.
Yeah, and I mean, and getting all the Howard stuff, the original versions of all the stories printed. That was like basically all because of Wagner. Why we have like those Del Rey editions, for example. You know what I mean?
That's right.
Like like yeah, I think that at this point it's kind of like you need somebody like doing the same thing for Wagner. Like, but I think that if he had survived and been able to keep his stuff in print, I think his name would be a lot bigger.
No, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of but it's I think that it should be like much much bigger. Like a story like this. I mean, like I really like. I mean, I'm still I haven't read a lot of Kane stuff. But this is one that I had listened to before because there was a guy who did a reading for it on YouTube. And he actually he had like a postscript on it where his interpretation of the story also was dealing with the Age of Giants in terms of pulp fiction, like
Oh, right.
like that to a certain extent there's maybe a little bit of a kind of metaphor in the story of like the Age of Giants, before and that kind of passing out, which I thought was an interesting interpretation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, definitely. But except for now, there seems to be this like whole like revitalization of like weird fiction and cosmic horror and pulpy stuff seems to be like popular again, in
Yeah, I
some
think
ways.
it goes through. I think it goes through waves because you remember back in like the '90s, there was like a bunch revival of a lot of interest in the kind of pulp stuff where you even like where you had like the Shadow and like the Phantom movies and you know what I mean.
That's
Like
true. Yeah.
the funny thing though is those things didn't do very good, but I think that was probably the generation who grew up on that stuff trying to make movies out of it. But I do think that there's kind of a ebb and flow. But I do think that weird fiction is um, probably like the most popular it's been as long as I can remember.
Yeah. No, I mean, especially with like, I mean, I know, the Color Out of Space came out a couple of years ago and Richard Stanley had some problems, unfortunately, and being canceled or some hearsay stuff that was going on with him. And so it doesn't look like he's going to be doing it anymore, at least in the foreseeable future with that, Lovecraft stuff. And he's like one of the perfect guys to make that sort of those kinds of movies. But there seems to, people are talking about Lovecraft again. People are talking about, you know, like heroic fantasy and, Game of Thrones was like big, like there was like one of the most successful shows on TV. And And I just think in general, like this type of stuff is like in people's consciousness more than it has been in a long time. So, hopefully someone decides to look at the Wagner's estate and get this stuff back in print. I mean, it's on Kindle, man. So like, let's have some hard copies of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I mean, I always talk about how, 15 years ago you couldn't find like the King in Yellow or any of that kind of stuff. And nowadays you can get a countless different editions of the
Oh
King in
yeah.
Yellow.
Yep.
No, but I mean, literally, I remember trying to find the King in Yellow back in, mid 2000s and it being literally impossible even from a library, like I
Yeah.
couldn't find a copy of it anywhere. So it's
Yeah.
like things have definitely changed with all that. I mean, you can find all this stuff so much easier than it was, and I think that helps add to the ability for people to get into it. And I think, yeah, I mean, like Lovecraft is like risen, even with people trying to cancel him or whatever, doesn't seem to stop him like growing in popularity. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Now people seem to, put that in perspective. But yeah, the takeaway is go out and read all these stories and you know,
Yeah,
hopefully
read this story.
hopefully that'll make a difference. Maybe we should
Yeah.
start a campaign, trying to get the Night Winds republished, because I mean the collection's already there. There's a Night Winds collection. That's like it'd be great to have a new volume of that out there, with like awesome like artwork and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, like a bet. Yeah, it would be cool to have somebody like Chiroptera do something that with like some awesome artwork and yeah, and I'm looking forward to getting more into Kane. Like, off to a great start. Like, I really loved like the particularly their philosophic conversation. The story I just thought was great. Like
Yeah.
so many great lines in it, and particularly like the kind of real pessimistic stuff like about
Well, I mean that
mankind's place in the universe. I love that stuff.
as much as I like the action, my the biggest thing I loved about these stories is because I reread all this stuff last year, like when I discovered them on Kindle, I was like, oh, I could just read them on my tablet now, and I read all of the stories again last year, like around this time, like around Christmas time last year. I started revisiting all this, and it's the action's fun, the sword play is good, but it's like even in Undertow, the meditation on loneliness, and those are the things that I really appreciate about the Kane character is the fact that he's immortal and his perspective on these philosophies and loneliness and the eternity and all that kind of stuff. It's like really, really interesting.
Yeah, that's my favorite part of the story is like Wagner does do action good. I don't think he does it as good as Howard,
No,
but
Howard's the best at that. Yeah.
yeah, like Howard's the best story writer, as far as I think that I've ever read. I mean, the way that his prose really propels the whole story, but Wagner does a really good job of action as well. But he really excels at the kind of philosophic side of things. But he does manage to do, what Howard did, which is, if you read story like Queen of the Black Coast, you get these like kind of philosophic digressions that from Conan and stuff and mixed in with the action. I definitely think that Wagner does that good, but I also think that his stories are maybe a little bit more on the philosophic side, which I'm totally cool with. I really like that. I think his kind of philosophy is interesting, and you definitely see a strong pessimism that wouldn't be too far off from Ligotti in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah, for sure, definitely. Yeah. So there you have it, guys. That's Two Suns Setting. It's we're off to a strong start in this next phase of Darkness Weaves. And so everyone get out there and start reading these stories, man, and discover the awesome world of Karl Edward Wagner. And thanks, Karl, for joining me on this.
Oh yeah, man. I'm really enjoying getting into the Kane stuff. So we're off to a good start.
All right, guys, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Bye.
I'll see you, Karl. Bye.
Bye.